The first time someone told me girls shouldn't run grain silos, I was 17 and had just finished loading 3 trucks faster than any of the boys at Henderson's elevator. Sweat dripped from my cap as I watched the last truck pull away, its cargo hold filled with perfectly graded wheat that would fetch top dollar at market. "Nice work, kid," old Henderson said, not unkindly, but with that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "But you know this is just temporary summer help, right? Come fall, you'll want to focus on finding yourself a nice boy to marry." I stood there in the dust, watching him walk away, my calloused hands still vibrating from operating the grain auger all morning. The other workers, all men, avoided my eyes as they headed to lunch. They'd seen me outwork most of them, but acknowledging it would mean admitting something they weren't ready to face. That evening, I sat on our porch steps, staring across the endless Kansas wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. My father had taught me to read the grain market reports before I could properly read chapter books. I knew the difference between hard red winter wheat and soft white wheat by feel alone. I could operate every piece of equipment at that elevator better than men twice my age. But apparently, none of that mattered because I wore a ponytail instead of a baseball cap, because I had to shop in the women's section instead of the men's. The unfairness of it burned in my chest like acid, mixing with a determination that would prove to be more valuable than any college degree. I made a promise to myself that night, watching the stars appear over the grain fields. Someday, I wouldn't just work at a grain elevator. I'd own one. 2 years passed before I understood that wanting something wasn't enough. You had to learn how to take it. While my high school classmates prepared for college or planned weddings, I spent every free moment at the grain elevator, studying not just the physical work, but the business itself. Henderson tolerated my questions at first, probably thinking it was cute that the summer girl wanted to understand profit margins in futures contracts. He stopped thinking it was cute when I started pointing out inefficiencies in his operation, suggesting improvements that could increase throughput by 15%. "You're getting a little too big for your britches, Missy," he warned me one September afternoon after I'd presented him with a detailed analysis of his operational costs compared to 3 neighboring elevators. But I'd already learned something crucial. Knowledge was power, and they couldn't take that away from me no matter how uncomfortable it made them. I subscribed to grain market publications with my own money, studied agricultural economics textbooks I borrowed from the community college library, and most importantly, I listened to every conversation the men thought I couldn't hear. That's how I learned about Thompson's elevator going up for sale. Thompson was retiring, his kids had moved to the city, and he was looking for a quick sale to someone local. The asking price was reasonable, if you had access to agricultural loans and a business plan that banks would take seriously. I started drafting my proposal that night, working by lamplight at our kitchen table long after my parents had gone to bed. My mother found me there one morning at dawn, surrounded by financial projections and market analysis. "Honey," she said gently, "maybe you should think about something more practical." The disappointment cut deeper than Henderson's dismissal ever had. The loan officer at First National Bank didn't even pretend to take me seriously. He was polite enough, in that condescending way that made my skin crawl, but his decision was made before I even opened my folder of financial projections. "Miss Williams, you have to understand, this is a substantial investment. Running a grain elevator isn't like running a beauty salon or a flower shop. It's heavy industry, requires substantial equipment knowledge, and the profit margins are razor thin." I slid my business plan across his desk. 47 pages of market analysis, operational improvements, and 5-year financial projections that I'd worked on for 3 months. He barely glanced at it. "Besides," he continued, "what happens when you get married and start having babies? A husband isn't going to want his wife operating dangerous grain equipment. It's just not practical." I sat there for a moment, feeling something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. This man, who'd probably never operated anything more complex than a lawnmower, was lecturing me about grain equipment. This man, who'd inherited his position from his father, was telling me about practical career choices. "Mr. Davidson," I said, my voice steadied despite the fury building inside me. "I've been operating grain equipment since I was 14. I can tell you the moisture content of wheat by looking at it, and I know the current futures price for corn better than you know your own checking account balance. But thank you for your time." I stood up, gathered my business plan, and walked out of that bank with my head high and my heart pounding. Behind me, I heard him mutter something to his secretary about ambitious young girls and reality checks. That evening, I drove past Thompson's elevator, watching the sunset behind the towering silos. The property looked tired, like it was waiting for someone to believe in it again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the 70-year-old widow who ran the town's only accounting firm from above the hardware store. She'd been watching my situation unfold with interest, and one day she called me into her office. "I've been thinking about your elevator plan," she said without preamble. "Davidson's an idiot, but that doesn't solve your funding problem." She opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "I've got 12 clients who are sitting on more money than they know what to do with. Farmers who've had good years, retirees with cash investments earning nothing in savings accounts. They're not interested in the stock market, but they might be interested in a local investment with someone who actually knows the business." I stared at her, hardly daring to hope. "You mean private investors?" "I mean people who've watched you work for 3 summers and know you're not some flighty girl playing dress-up in daddy's overalls. People who understand that smart money follows smart operators, regardless of what gender they happen to be." Within 2 weeks, I had my first investor, Jake Morrison, a retired farmer who'd been watching grain prices for 40 years and recognized talent when he saw it. Then came Sarah Chen, who'd inherited her family's farm and understood the challenges of being underestimated in agriculture. By the end of the month, I had enough backing to make a serious offer on Thompson's elevator. The day I signed the purchase agreement, Henderson stopped by Thompson's place to see who the new buyer was. His face went through several expressions when he saw me: surprise, disbelief, and finally something that might have been respect. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "You actually did it." I looked at him across the table where I'd just signed my name to the biggest financial commitment of my life. "Mr. Henderson, this is just the beginning." Owning the elevator and running it profitably turned out to be 2 entirely different challenges. My first harvest season was baptism by fire. 18-hour days, equipment breakdowns, and the constant pressure of farmers depending on me to handle their grain efficiently and fairly. The hardest part wasn't the physical demands or even the technical problems. It was earning the respect of the seasonal workers I needed to hire, men who'd been working grain harvest longer than I'd been alive and weren't thrilled about taking orders from someone they still saw as that summer girl from Henderson's place. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging day in late September. Our main conveyor belt snapped during the peak of harvest, backing up 6 trucks loaded with corn. The repair would normally take 4 hours, but I couldn't afford that kind of delay. Not in my first season, not with farmers already skeptical about my ability to handle their grain. While my crew stood around discussing the problem, I climbed into the elevator housing and started rewiring the backup system I'd installed the previous month. It was dangerous work, requiring me to crawl through tight spaces with live electrical equipment, but I designed the modification myself and knew exactly how to implement it. 2 hours later, we were back online. As the trucks started moving again, I caught something I hadn't seen before in my workers' eyes: respect. Not grudging acceptance or polite tolerance, but genuine respect for someone who'd solved their problem faster and more efficiently than they could have managed themselves. That night, my lead operator, Jim Collins, approached me as I locked up the office. "Boss," he said, the first time he'd called me anything other than Miss. That was some fine work today. Most owners would have just waited for the repair crew. I realized something had shifted. I wasn't fighting for acceptance anymore. I was earning it, one problem solved at a time. Success in business, I learned, attracts both opportunities and enemies. By the end of my second year, my elevator was consistently outperforming Henderson's operation, handling more volume with better efficiency and higher customer satisfaction. This didn't go unnoticed by the farming community or by Henderson himself. The opportunity came in the form of Miller's elevator, 30 miles east. Miller was having financial difficulties, struggling with outdated equipment and poor management. His banks were getting nervous, and word was spreading that he might be forced to sell. I drove over there on a gray March morning, ostensibly just to look around. What I found was a facility with good bones but terrible operations, grain sitting too long in storage, equipment that hadn't been properly maintained, and a demoralized staff who clearly knew their jobs better than their boss did. Miller himself was a decent man who'd inherited the business from his father and was drowning in an industry that had grown more complex than he could handle. When I approached him about a partnership, he was initially resistant. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Williams, but I'm not sure what a young lady like yourself could bring to this operation." I spent the next hour walking through his facility, pointing out inefficiencies and suggesting improvements. By the time we finished, he was looking at me differently. The partnership we negotiated saved Miller's business and gave me operational control of my second elevator. More importantly, it established a new model. Instead of waiting for facilities to fail and buying them cheap, I could step in as an operational partner and turn struggling businesses into profitable ones. Henderson wasn't pleased when he heard about the Miller partnership. He cornered me at the co-op meeting in April, his face red with anger. "You're getting a little too big for this county, girl. Some folks think maybe you should slow down before you get in over your head." I met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Henderson, I've been in over my head since the day I started. The difference is, I learned how to swim. Success made me a target. That became clear the morning I arrived at my original elevator to find a broken window and 'Go home' spray painted across the office door. The local sheriff took my report with professional courtesy, but little enthusiasm. "Probably just kids," he said, though we both knew better. "You might want to think about installing some security cameras." The vandalism was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I dealt with delayed parts deliveries, sudden inspection visits from county officials, and a whisper campaign suggesting I was cutting corners on grain quality standards. None of it was explicitly criminal, but the message was clear. Some people wanted me gone. The pressure campaign reached its peak when Henderson made me an offer I was clearly supposed to refuse. He walked into my office one afternoon with a contract that would give him operational control of both my elevators in exchange for what he called a very generous buyout. "This is a fair offer," he said, spreading the papers across my desk. "More than fair considering the challenges you're facing. Take the money, find yourself a nice husband, and let the men handle the heavy lifting." I read through the contract carefully, noting how it was structured to leave me with very little actual cash after paying off my investors and loans. It was designed to look generous while actually being anything but. "This is interesting, Mr. Henderson," I said finally. "But I'm not interested in selling." His face darkened. "You might want to reconsider. This business can be dangerous for someone who doesn't understand how things work around here. Accidents happen. Equipment fails. Sometimes it's better to walk away while you still can." The threat hadn't been subtle. Henderson was escalating from economic pressure to something more personal. That evening, I called Mrs. Patterson and told her what had happened. Her response was immediate and fierce. "That old fool just made the biggest mistake of his life. You don't threaten people I've invested in." By morning, I had more than moral support. I had a plan. Mrs. Patterson's plan was elegant in its simplicity. If Henderson wanted to play hardball, we'd show him what that actually looked like. She'd spent 50 years managing the financial affairs of half the county, and she knew where every skeleton was buried. Henderson's been cutting corners on his grain storage contracts for years, she explained over coffee in her office. He's also been padding his insurance claims and fudging his weight reports to the state. I've got documentation. But instead of going to the authorities, she suggested something more strategic. What if Henderson's biggest clients knew they could get better service, better prices, and more honest dealing somewhere else? Over the next month, I systematically approached Henderson's top 10 customers. I didn't badmouth him directly. I didn't need to. I simply presented them with detailed comparisons of pricing, service standards, and operational efficiency. The numbers spoke for themselves. 6 of Henderson's clients switched to my operation before harvest season. 2 more followed after they heard about the improved service their neighbors were getting. By October, Henderson's volume was down 40%, and mine had increased enough to justify hiring additional staff. The morning Henderson lost his biggest account, Morrison Farms, a 3,000-acre operation that had been with him for 15 years, he showed up at my office again. This time, his anger had been replaced by something that looked like fear. "You're trying to destroy me," he said. I looked up from the market reports I'd been reviewing. "Mr. Henderson, I'm trying to run a business. If your customers prefer working with me, that's not destruction. That's competition." "This isn't over," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. We both knew he was losing, and we both knew why. That afternoon, Jake Morrison stopped by my office with a grin. "Heard Henderson wasn't too happy about losing our account." "He'll adjust," I replied. "Or he won't. Either way, I've got grain to move and farmers to serve." As he left, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I wasn't the underdog fighting for acceptance anymore. I was becoming the standard that others would be measured against. The opportunity to acquire my 3rd elevator came from an unexpected source: Henderson himself. 18 months after our confrontation, his operation was struggling badly. The loss of major customers, combined with 2 poor harvest seasons and increasing maintenance costs on aging equipment, had pushed him to the edge of bankruptcy. His bank, the same First National where Davidson had dismissed me 3 years earlier, approached me through Mrs. Patterson. They needed someone to take over Henderson's operation before it defaulted entirely, and I was the only operator in the region with both the capital and the expertise to make it work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Davidson, who'd once lectured me about the impracticality of women in agriculture, was now begging me to save one of his largest commercial loans. I spent a week analyzing Henderson's books and touring his facility. The equipment was in worse condition than I'd expected. The customer relationships were strained, and the operational efficiency was terrible. But the location was strategic, and the storage capacity would complement my existing operations perfectly. When I met with Henderson to discuss the terms, he looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 2. The bluster and condescension were gone, replaced by the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd fought a battle he couldn't win. "I suppose you're enjoying this?" he said, as we sat in his office, soon to be my office. "Mr. Henderson, I take no pleasure in anyone's failure, but I won't apologize for succeeding either." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the silos that had been his life's work. "You know, I always thought you were just playing at this. Thought you'd get bored and move on to something easier." "I never wanted anything easy," I replied. "I wanted something that mattered." The acquisition was completed in November, giving me operational control of 3 grain elevators covering a 50-mile radius. The day I had my name painted on Henderson's silos, now my silos, several of the men who'd dismissed me 3 years earlier stopped by to congratulate me. I'd finally forced them to look at me as exactly what I'd always been, a businesswoman who happened to be better at this than most of them would ever be. By the 4th year of my operation, I was processing grain for over 200 farmers across 3 counties, employing 47 people, and handling nearly 15% of the region's total grain volume. The Regional Agricultural Association could no longer ignore what I'd built. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. "Miss Williams, this is Robert Chen from the Midwest Grain Operators Association. We'd like to invite you to speak at our annual conference about operational efficiency in modern grain handling." I'd attended that conference twice as a customer, watching from the back of the room while industry leaders discussed trends and challenges. Now they wanted me on the main stage, sharing the strategies that had built my operation from a single struggling elevator into a regional powerhouse. The speech I gave that April morning was attended by over 300 grain operators from 6 states. I talked about efficiency improvements, customer service standards, and the importance of treating grain handling as both an industrial process and a customer service business. What I didn't talk about was gender or barriers, or the men who'd told me this wasn't a place for women. I didn't need to. My results spoke for themselves. The standing ovation was gratifying, but what mattered more were the conversations afterward. Operators who'd been in the business for decades asked detailed questions about my methods. Equipment manufacturers wanted to discuss my ideas for improving grain handling systems. 3 different agricultural colleges invited me to lecture their students. That evening, at the association's annual dinner, I was presented with their Innovation in Operations Award. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of industry peers who now viewed me as an equal, I thought about that 17-year-old girl who'd been told she should focus on finding a husband instead of loading grain trucks. "This award belongs not just to me," I said, "but to everyone who believed that good ideas and hard work matter more than preconceived notions about who belongs in this industry." Later, as I drove home through the Kansas night, I realized I'd achieved something beyond business success. I'd changed how an entire industry thought about merit and capability. Success gave me a platform, and I decided to use it. The following year, I established an internship program specifically designed to attract young women to careers in agricultural operations. The response was overwhelming. Applications came from farm girls across the Midwest who'd grown up hearing the same dismissive comments I'd faced. The first class of interns arrived that summer. 8 young women between the ages of 18 and 22, all hungry to prove themselves in an industry that had traditionally overlooked them. I threw them into the full complexity of grain operations: equipment maintenance, quality control, customer relations, and financial management. Sarah Mitchell, a 20-year-old from Nebraska, turned out to have an intuitive understanding of grain market dynamics that impressed even my most experienced traders. Jessica Rodriguez from Iowa could diagnose equipment problems by sound alone. Amanda Foster from Missouri developed efficiency improvements that increased our throughput by 12%. But the most important lesson I taught them wasn't technical. It was psychological. "Nobody is going to hand you respect," I told them during our weekly training sessions. "You have to earn it, over and over, until they can't ignore your competence anymore." By the end of the summer, my interns had proven themselves capable of handling every aspect of grain operations. 3 of them received job offers from competitors who'd initially been skeptical about hiring women for technical positions. 2 others decided to pursue agricultural engineering degrees, with plans to return to the industry as equipment specialists. The program's success attracted national attention. Agricultural magazines wrote feature articles about my operation. Television news programs did segments on changing demographics in farming, and I was invited to speak at universities across the country. The moment that mattered most came when Sarah Mitchell approached me in my office at summer's end. "Miss Williams, I've been accepted to agricultural engineering school, but I've also had 3 job offers. I'm not sure which path to choose." "Sarah," I said, "choose the path that challenges you most. The industry needs people who push boundaries, not people who settle for what's comfortable." Watching her walk out of my office, I realized I'd created something more valuable than a successful business. I'd created a pipeline of talented women who would never have to fight the battles I'd fought. 5 years after acquiring my first elevator, I stood on the observation platform of my newest facility, a state-of-the-art grain terminal that could process twice the volume of my original operation. The investment had been substantial, but the returns justified every dollar. My operation now handled grain for over 400 farmers and employed nearly 70 people across 4 locations. The regional impact was undeniable. Property values had increased around my facilities. Local banks had expanded their agricultural lending programs, and 3 equipment manufacturers had established regional service centers specifically to support my operations. I'd become what economists call a catalyst business, one that generates economic activity far beyond its own boundaries. But the personal satisfaction went deeper than financial success. That morning, I received a letter from Amanda Foster, one of my former interns who was now managing grain operations for a co-op in Montana. She'd implemented several innovations she'd learned during her summer with me, increasing efficiency by 23% and earning recognition as the youngest facility manager in her company's history. "Your program didn't just teach me technical skills. she wrote. It taught me that I belonged in this industry, regardless of what anyone else thought about women in agriculture. Similar letters arrived regularly, from former interns who'd become equipment specialists, agricultural lenders, and facility managers across the Midwest. Each one represented a small victory in the larger battle to change an industry's assumptions about talent and capability. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson stopped by my office with news that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. 2 of the region's largest grain operations were being sold, and both sellers had specifically requested that I be given first opportunity to bid. "They want you because you're the best operator in the region," she said, with obvious pride. Gender never even came up in the conversations. I looked out my office window at the silos bearing my name, processing grain from farms across 3 counties. The teenage girl who'd been told to find a husband instead of loading trucks had built something none of us had imagined possible. But as I considered those new acquisition opportunities, I realized my ambitions had evolved beyond simply proving doubters wrong. I was building something larger, a business that would outlast me, and a legacy that would make the next generation's battles easier than mine had been. 10 years after that first dismissive conversation with Henderson, I stood before the largest grain industry conference in the region, delivering the keynote address on innovative agricultural operations. The audience included many of the same men who'd once questioned whether women belonged in their industry. My operation now encompassed 6 grain elevators across 4 counties, employed over 100 people, and processed nearly 30% of the region's grain volume. The internship program had expanded to include partnerships with 3 agricultural colleges, and former participants were now running operations from Kansas to North Dakota. But the moment that brought everything full circle happened after my speech, when a young man approached me with obvious nervousness. He introduced himself as Henderson's grandson, recently graduated from agricultural college and looking for his first job in grain operations. "Mr. Henderson, my grandfather. He said I should talk to you about opportunities," he stammered. "He said you run the best operation in the region, and that I could learn more working for you than anywhere else." I studied this young man, seeing echoes of his grandfather, but also something different. Respect, humility, and genuine eagerness to learn. Henderson himself had approached me the year before, asking if I'd consider hiring his grandson when he graduated. The request had come without conditions or patronizing advice, just one professional asking another for an opportunity. "What did your grandfather tell you about working here?" I asked. The young man's face reddened slightly. "He said you'd expect excellence, that you wouldn't tolerate excuses, and that if I worked hard and paid attention, I'd learn from the best operator he'd ever seen." I hired him that day. 3 months later, as harvest season reached its peak, I watched Henderson's grandson efficiently coordinating the loading of 6 trucks simultaneously, a complex operation that required precise timing and clear communication. He'd absorbed everything we'd taught him, and was already suggesting improvements to our processes. That evening, as I locked up my office, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred. The industry that had once seemed determined to exclude me now looked to me for leadership. The men who'd once avoided my eyes now sought my opinion on market trends and operational strategies. The girl who'd been told she shouldn't run grain silos now owned 6 of them, employed over 100 people, and had fundamentally changed how an entire region thought about talent and opportunity in agriculture. They still won't look me in the eye, not out of dismissal now, but out of the kind of respect that comes from being proven so completely wrong that acknowledgement feels like surrender. But I don't need their surrender anymore. I have something better. Their recognition that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, and success makes all arguments irrelevant. Thank you so much for listening to this story of determination, growth, and proving that talent and hard work matter more than anyone's preconceived notions about who belongs where. I hope it inspired you to pursue your own dreams, regardless of what others might say about your place in the world. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of people who refused to accept limitations and built something extraordinary instead. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories of triumph over doubt. Until next time, remember, they might tell you that you don't belong, but your results will prove them wrong every single time.